Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on Indian removal, treaty law, and the sovereignty crisis of the Jacksonian era. The core question is this: what does treaty law mean when a government recognizes native sovereignty only until land hunger overwhelms it? The core competency is to discuss the patterns of westward migration and the range of responses from native peoples. What does treaty law mean when a government recognizes native sovereignty only until land hunger overwhelms it? By the 1820s and 1830s, the United States had already developed a long practice of dealing with native nations through treaties. Federal officials negotiated boundaries, land cessions, peace terms, and trade arrangements in formal diplomatic language. That history is decisive because Indian removal did not happen in a vacuum of misunderstanding. American officials knew how to recognize native political status when recognition was useful. The crisis came when white settlement, cotton expansion, and state pressure made that recognition inconvenient. In the Southeast, the stakes were high. Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole peoples occupied land that white settlers, speculators, and planters wanted. Short staple cotton spread across the region after the cotton gin made processing more profitable. Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and other areas became central to plantation expansion. Enslaved labor moved with that expansion. Land was the hinge between these developments. A government that had once signed treaties with native nations now faced a powerful white demand to convert native land into surveyed, saleable, taxable territory. The issue was not only movement westward, it was the legal status of native homelands. Could a native nation hold territory inside state boundaries and exercise self-government there? Could federal treaty obligations restrain state legislatures and settler pressure? Those questions became urgent because removal required more than force. It required a decision about which law would count when laws collided. The Cherokee Nation provides the clearest example of native adaptation and political persistence. During the early 19th century, Cherokee leaders adopted a written constitution, developed a bicameral legislative system, and used a written language system advanced by Sequoyah. The Cherokee Phoenix, a bilingual newspaper, circulated political argument in print. Mission schools, farms, roads, and legal institutions demonstrated that Cherokee leaders understood the terms the United States claimed to respect. They were not outside politics. They were operating within it. Georgia moved in the opposite direction. White Georgians wanted more land for settlement and plantation agriculture. State officials passed laws extending state jurisdiction over Cherokee territory, limiting Cherokee government, and preparing for distribution of land. The discovery of gold in North Georgia in 1828 increased pressure further. Georgia surveyed and distributed plots through a land lottery, treating Cherokee space as territory to be allocated rather than sovereignty to be honored. Surveying itself became a political act. Once lines were drawn and parcels imagined, removal moved closer to administrative reality. Congress gave federal backing to the shift through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The statute authorized the president to negotiate the exchange of lands east of the Mississippi for lands in the west, especially present-day Indian Territory in what became Oklahoma. Supporters described the act as exchange, safety, and orderly relocation. Its defenders said removal would separate native peoples from hostile state populations and reduce conflict. The language sounded administrative, the circumstances were coercive. State pressure, settler demand, and presidential support left native leaders negotiating under narrowing options. Removal also depended on earlier precedents. The United States had long used treaties to obtain native land. What changed in the Jacksonian era was the pace, the pressure, and the willingness to override native claims backed by earlier treaties. Treaties were no longer reliable shields. They became instruments through which federal officials tried to formalize decisions already driven by land appetite and political power. Missionaries, traders, and federal Indian agents all worked inside this environment. Some missionaries defended Cherokee rights and literacy. Some agents pressed for cessions. Federal officials collected information, arranged talks, and reported on factional divisions within native nations. Their paperwork helped Washington decide whom to recognize and when. Removal thus advanced through letters, reports, and treaty drafts long before soldiers marched. Cherokee Principal Chief John Ross responded with petitions, memorials, negotiations, and legal action. Ross and other leaders argued that the Cherokee Nation was a political community entitled to treaty protection and internal self-government. Their strategy was deliberate. They used written appeals to Congress, public argument, and the courts because they believed the United States might yet honor its own constitutional structure. One key legal battle became Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831. The Cherokee sought an injunction against Georgia laws, but the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled that the Cherokee Nation was not a foreign nation in the constitutional sense required to bring the case directly. Marshall called native nations domestic dependent nations. That phrase acknowledged a distinct status while also limiting full sovereignty. The decision disappointed Cherokee leaders because it failed to block Georgia's advance. It also revealed the instability of federal doctrine. Native nations were recognized enough to be different, but not enough to stand securely on equal diplomatic ground in court. The next year produced Worcester v. Georgia in 1832. Samuel Worcester, a missionary living in Cherokee territory, challenged Georgia's requirement that white residents there obtain state licenses. The Supreme Court ruled in Worcester's favor and held that Georgia's laws had no force within Cherokee territory because relations with native nations belonged to the federal government. This was a major statement on native sovereignty and federal supremacy. On paper, it was a strong defense of Cherokee political status. On the ground, it was weak without enforcement. Georgia resisted. President Jackson did not act decisively to protect the court's principle. Whether or not later quotations attributed to Jackson are exact, the practical outcome is clear. The administration did not force compliance in a way that preserved Cherokee sovereignty. Meanwhile, treaty pressure intensified across the Southeast. The Choctaws signed the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830 and began removal soon after. The Creek faced land cessions, fraud, internal division, and eventual forced migration after conflict in Alabama. The Chickasaw negotiated sale terms before moving west. The Seminole resisted more directly, and the Second Seminole War, beginning in 1835, became one of the longest and costliest conflicts between the United States and native peoples. Removal, therefore, did not proceed through a single method. It combined pressured treaties, fraud, military force, and administrative follow-through. Military and logistical realities shaped the human outcome. Federal agents had to gather people, count households, arrange wagons, contract supplies, coordinate routes, and move thousands westward. Disease spread in camps and on the road. Contractors and officials often failed to provide adequate food, transport, or shelter. The later Cherokee removal of 1838 and 1839, remembered as the Trail of Tears, followed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, which a small minority faction signed without the support of John Ross and the majority of the Cherokee Nation. The Senate ratified it anyway by a single vote. That fact exposes the machinery. Removal turned on paperwork accepted by the federal state even when the legitimacy of the signers was widely disputed among the Cherokee themselves. Winfield Scott oversaw parts of the final Cherokee roundup with federal troops and militia support. Families were forced from homes into stockades before beginning the westward march. Some detachments traveled by river, others overland. Winter conditions worsened suffering. Historians often estimate that thousands died from cold, malnutrition, and disease during the Cherokee removal alone. The route became famous, but the stockade, the inventory, the contract, and the guard detail are part of the same story. The Indian Removal Act is the central source because it shows how statutory language can soften coercion without removing it. The act authorized the president to cause lands west of the Mississippi to be divided into districts in exchange for lands occupied by native tribes within state or territorial boundaries. It framed removal in terms of negotiation and exchange. That language softened coercion without removing it. Congress did not openly write a statute that said the United States would seize land outright in every case. It wrote a law that used the forms of agreement. Reading the act against events in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama reveals the tension. An exchange conducted under heavy political pressure is not a neutral bargain. Native nations were not negotiating from secure control of their territory. State governments were already pressing claims. Settlers already wanted occupancy. Gold discoveries and cotton profits raised the pressure. Federal willingness to protect treaty rights had weakened. The statute therefore read as if options remained open while actual choices narrowed. The act also sharpened executive power because it placed the executive branch at the center. Once Congress authorized removal, presidents and federal agents handled negotiation, supervision, and logistics. Surveyors, commissioners, military officers, and clerks translated the law into movement. The distance between statutory language and lived outcome widened in that process. The law could speak of accommodation while the administration prepared routes, contracts, and troop escorts. The statute grows sharper when placed beside Worcester versus Georgia. One text offers a legal defense of native territorial sovereignty. The other offers statutory machinery for relocation. The federal government possessed both languages at once, judicial recognition and removal administration. When the two collided, removal won because enforcement and political will moved in its direction. That sequence explains more than abstract principle. The Constitution, the court, and treaty history did not disappear. They were overridden in practice. The act also makes clear that land west of the Mississippi was being treated as exchange space open to federal assignment. That assumption ignored Native peoples already living there, and the instability of promising permanence in territory the United States might later reorganize again. Removal policy spoke as if one displacement could solve another. The statute therefore carried a second sovereignty problem inside it. Land promised to removed peoples remained under U.S. authority and future pressure. Indian removal transformed the Southeast. Native homelands were open to white settlement, state jurisdiction, and plantation development. Cotton production expanded. Enslaved people were driven into new territories through the domestic slave trade. Counties, roads, courthouses, and land offices followed. Survey lines and tax records replaced native jurisdiction in places where treaty rights had once stood. Westward migration thus depended on legal and administrative destruction before it became ordinary settlement. For native peoples, the consequences included death, disease, dispossession, and political rupture. Communities were split by competing treaty strategies and by the physical demands of relocation. People lost homes, fields, burial grounds, and local political worlds built over generations. The Trail of Tears became the most remembered removal route, but the suffering extended across multiple nations and years. The Seminole War showed that some resisted through prolonged conflict. The Choctaw Creek and Chickasaw experiences showed that pressured treaties could be just as devastating as open battlefield defeat. For the United States, removal exposed the limits of its constitutional claims. Federal treaty practice, Supreme Court doctrine, and public declarations of lawful government all existed. They did not control events once the demand for land reached sufficient political strength. A republic that could speak in legal forms and still destroy a recognized native sovereignty revealed something central about the age. Law had force, but enforcement and public will drove the outcome. The issue also connected directly to Jacksonian democracy. Expanded white male participation did not restrain removal. It often supported it. Settler majorities and state politicians treated native land as a prize of democratic expansion. The same republic that celebrated popular politics also normalized the displacement of peoples excluded from that political people. Westward migration then cannot be separated from removal policy. The roads west were cleared by statute, treaty manipulation, survey work, and military force before wagons turned them into settlement routes. Removal also reshaped the federal government's western footprint. Once native nations were pushed westward, the Army, Indian agents, and treaty officials had to manage new boundaries and new conflicts in Indian territory and beyond. The policy did not end federal native conflict. It moved and widened it. That is one reason removal should be read as a long administrative and military project, rather than a single legislative moment in 1830. Removal proved that the federal government could recognize native sovereignty in treaties and cast it aside when settlement and cotton demanded more land. The harder judgment is what treaty language is worth when the same government reserves the power to treat recognition as temporary convenience. The law remained on the page while nations were driven west.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.